All right. What's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. Just wanted to go over the inflation part of the monetary policy report from this past February. Going over it one by one for the most part. I think the previous video we did the labor market statistics, and this one we're going to go over a lot of the inflation related stuff. So one of the things that they saw is that the monthly increases in personal consumption expenditures, which is the PCE prices, part of the PCE index and everything else, it averaged about the same in the second half as the first half and this is all with respect to 2021, right? So the first 6 months of 2021 versus the second 6 months, second set of 6 months in 2021. And so this brings the whole 12-month change in December to 5.8%, which is far above the FOMC's objective of 2%. Surprise. And here we see an actual graph where they give the monthly increase, like it's a monthly graph, so each point is a month, where they have this black line over here is the total going up here, and we see it come up here to what is it, 5.8? Here's the 5.8%. And then we have excluding food and energy, which is the core PCE. Just like the core CPI, you take out the two things that influence it the most, that go up the most, and it goes a little bit lower. This one looks like it's like 4.8 or 4.9. And then you have the trim mean as well. And so basically it's a lot more broad-based than in the first half. And so whereas the sizable price increases seen last spring were concentrated in a few key items, inflationary pressures broadened over the second half of 2021. And so basically in the first half of 2021, you saw the most of the inflation was in stuff like used cars, some energy, things like that. And it broadened out significantly. And there are actually some pretty interesting graphs below that we'll go into for probably a bit. So the broadening of price inflation is further evident when examining the price indexes for major PCE categories. And this is part of this, right? So we have different indices for the personal consumption expenditures, where we have food and beverages go up, and then we have energy, which is a lot more volatile, right? And so we see it actually go negative here, which makes sense because basically everything was shut down in 2020, and then as soon as we hit our recovery or whatever, what they call the recovery, we'll go with that. That's a matter of opinion. If you look into how they play with the numbers and stuff. Anyways, and then we also get some more same graphs for the services and stuff. So like housing services, X energy and housing. So now we're getting rid of housing too. And now this is for goods, but it's without food, beverages, and energy. So there's that. And you see the goods and services, or the goods one is up in the close to 7 range, whereas the services, it's still over 4. Here's the bulk of kind of what I wanted to talk about, is like how it's broadened out significantly. So consumer price inflation increased markedly in 2021, with the price index for personal consumption expenditures, PCE, rising 5.8% over the 12 months through December, following a subdued increase of 1.3% in 2020. So, in contrast, over the second half of the year, relatively high price increases became more widespread, suggesting that broader-based inflation pressures had taken hold. Basically, and this is where we get into the graphs I was brought up earlier with figure A. And basically what they did was they divided the goods and services that make up the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures, right? And they broke it up into 146 different categories. And basically, they found or they presented it with the share of those categories for which prices were increasing over 3%, and it seems like this is a 3% annualized rate, which I highlighted in blue. So the share of product categories with inflation above 3% temporarily reached a similar level on two other occasions since the 1990s, 2001 and 2007, but this share is still notably lower than that in the high inflation regime of the 1970s. And so basically here on this left half of figure A, we have a monthly graph of how they divided up this PCE index, right, into the different categories, into 146 different categories. And then this on the right hand side with this axis, we have the percentage of those categories that had an inflation over 3%, right? So we see it go back up to where it's probably about like 65% of those 146 categories had an inflation rate of above 3%. Which we saw something similar happen in, like we brought up earlier, 2007-ish, and then 2001. And then here's the whole 1970s inflation that we talk about, and the stagflationary period and everything else. And then here's basically the same thing, just in different time frames. And now we get down into figure B, which reports the shares of product categories for 12-month price changes above 3% separately. So it's the same graph as this. It's just this is all the entire personal consumption expenditures product categories. And then down here we have it separated into goods and services. So same concept, but now we have goods separated and services separated. And you can see how they went through the rest of the time, but mostly what we're paying attention to. And I wish I could like zoom in or like highlight specific parts of the graphs, but I can't do that on the actual graphs because of however they have it embedded into the website. I can't mark it up or highlight. So basically we see here with the goods, it's 70% of the goods in the PCE were had an inflation rate of 3%, and then a little bit above 60 for services. And we see a very similar thing over here in this one, where we have it's 3 months periods rather than just monthly. So to better understand the drivers of the high aggregate inflation last year, this figure down here presents the full distribution of price changes for different products and further emphasizes the different roles being played by prices of goods versus services in explaining changes in this distribution compared to the 2016 to 19 period. And so basically this is a distribution graph, right, or chart. And so we have on the bottom is the amount of inflation, or the change in the price change, the percentage price change of a specific category, right? And so again, we're taking the 146 categories and we'll say like this one had like 2% inflation. It goes in the 2% bin, right? Imagine like each one of these percent changes is a different bin, and you put each category in there and you fill it up to see what the distribution is. And you can kind of see, and this is an overlay, right? And so the white part is where they were the same, right? So you're filling up these bins, and then the part above it is where one time period had an excess compared to the other. So this light blue one is when we had, for example, okay, we'll say, what is this? This is 3%. Anyway, so 0 to 3%-ish in this light blue area here at the peak. These were the times in which we had 16% or 16. I believe it's just 16 like bin or categories. So 16 different categories, and that we divided our PCE up into, had a 3% inflation in the 2016 to 2019 period, right? And this one was more than the 2021. And so basically this is where we had in 2021 for this respective bin. This is how much more we had in this bin from 2016 to 2019. And then with the dark gray, it's 2021. So like up here in the 25% bin where we had 25% or more inflation, we had 8 different categories in the PCE have that much inflation. Where in 2021, whereas from 2016 to 2019 we only had 2. So that's kind of how to read this graph, right? That seems like it's not like a typical graph that seems very prominent unless you've had to read stuff like this before. One of the things I've noticed with my previous research experience and everything else was that how you portray data doesn't seem it isn't very intuitive to some people who don't deal with that stuff on a regular basis. And so dealing with a distribution graph isn't something that most people find as common sense, which is kind of why I wanted to go a little bit more into it and do the kind of basic kind of description, I guess. So basically, what does this show? And so basically, the higher and broader inflation during 2021 is reflected in the chart by the rightward shift of the distribution of price changes. Okay. And so we see this by the fact of this is 2021, right? The dark gray. And so we see at the higher range of this, the above 0, so positive, this is the categories that increased. We see a lot more gray, meaning that basically those categories shifted to higher inflation rates. So that's what they're talking about here, especially with respect to 2016 to 2019. And so again, so fewer items with price decreases, which are depicted in blue in the blue shaded area below 0 on the horizontal axis. And so this was where we had more categories in 2016 to 2019 in these bins, right? And so we had less price decreases in 2021 than we did in the other time period. Okay, point number 2, they said a notable decline in the occurrence of price increases of between 1 and 4%, which is shown in the blue shaded area in the middle of the distribution, which was this massive point that I was using to talk about the differences between the two different time periods. From 1 to 4%, they saw a notable decline. Obviously, there's a big, especially in 4%, where there's this big gap. You go from 16 categories in 2016 to 2019 down to 10, maybe 9. It's hard. They don't have tick marks, or it's not on a grid, so sometimes it's hard to see. Okay, so more items with inflation between 5 and 12%, as well as slightly more with inflation between 13 and 24, shown in the gray shaded area in those ranges on the horizontal axis. So this is where I was talking about earlier with all this gray right here for 2021, where we had significantly more categories that fit into the higher inflation bins in respect to this graph, right? And so again, the big point on the far right, where a striking 6% point increase at the very top of the distribution indicated by the large gray shaded spike in the share of items with price increases of at least 25%. That's this one right here, where we go from 2 to 8. All right, so 2% of the PCE bin, or I'm sorry, we went from 2%. Let me rephrase that. So we went from 2% of the categories in the PCE index to go in 2016 to 2019 to have at least 25% inflation up to 8%. That's what that means. So goods account for about 4 percentage points of the 6% point increase at the spike that I just talked about. And nearly all of the rightward shift in the price chain distribution in excess of 12% inflation. So basically, anything to the right of around here where my mouse is, from 12% and up, this was mostly due to goods, not necessarily just services, which we break down here, where you have the contribution of goods here on the left, and then of services on the right. Okay, and so you see that what they're talking about mostly. Above 12%, it's pretty much all gray. Where, yes, we have gray for the services side of it as well, but it's not continuous above 12%. Most of it's below it, because here's 12%, and so you have barely any here, and then a spike at least 25%, but not nearly as large as the for the goods. So there's that. Okay, so services account for the vast majority of the shift from the middle of the distribution of price changes, the blue shaded area, to inflation between 5 and 12%, the gray shaded area, while they account for less than 1/3 of the increase and spike at the top of the distribution. That's what I was just talking about with the at least 25%, how we have this one is about 1/3 of the total from this one. So services relative to goods. And as we can see, so from these graphs, these two and the one above, if we basically get that the big inflation categories were mostly goods, so above 12%, but in between 5 and 12%, most of that was from services. In terms of where the shifts were going, right? And so essentially with the goods, they shifted more to the above 12% inflation rates, whereas the services shifted not as much, but still to 5 to 12%. And this is all in 1 year. So that said, most of last year's very high inflation readings were concentrated in goods, like we've been talking about, a reflection of strong demand in the face of supply bottlenecks that have particularly affected these items. Fair enough. In the period ahead, the large price changes in goods may ease once supply chain disruptions finally resolve. But if labor shortages continue and wages rise faster than productivity in a broad-based way, inflation pressures may persist and continue to broaden out, which would basically be just a further shift of these categories to the right, right? So we'd see an even greater shift to the positive far right in terms of the horizontal axis. So that's pretty much all I wanted to go to in this one, because I want to keep these videos relatively short, and this one's already 20 minutes almost. That's pretty much, and also I put a link in the description for the video to this to the website where you can actually read the monetary policy report, and I believe it's directly to part 1. You can just switch between the parts on the right, and I zoomed in a lot because otherwise the graphs are like that big, and I'm blind, so I can't see them. But yeah, that is the PCE and how inflation has increased significantly last year. All right, well, I will continue to read on. The next one will be more about the GDP numbers and like imports and exports and stuff like that. All this is the whole point is supposed to be a learning experience. So hopefully it helps you guys out. And I'll see you guys on the next video.